Before you continue watching, know that what you're about to hear will disturb your sleep tonight. Welcome back to Silent Fears. If you're new here, subscribe now. Tonight, 7 documented Alaskan encounters that investigators refuse to discuss. Official police reports, survivor testimonies, real consequences. Some escaped to tell their story, others vanished without a trace. What you're about to hear happened to real people in real places. Let's move to our first story. Alaska State Trooper Report number 87-2451, filed November 15, 1987. Subject: Thomas, age 35. Licensed tourist guide operating out of Anchorage. What you're about to hear comes directly from official documentation, witness statements, and emergency service recordings that remained classified for over 2 decades. Thomas had been guiding hunting parties through Alaska's remote wilderness for 12 years without incident. On November 12, 1987, he was contracted to lead a 3-day expedition along the Richardson Highway, specifically targeting the remote area near mile marker 185, approximately 40 miles south of Fairbanks. The client was Dr. James, a cardiologist from Seattle seeking his first Alaskan hunting experience. Weather conditions were reported as clear with temperatures holding steady at minus 18 degrees Fahrenheit. According to Thomas's statement, the first day proceeded normally. They established base camp near a frozen creek bed, approximately 2 miles off the main highway. Dr. James proved to be an inexperienced but enthusiastic hunter, requiring constant guidance on basic wilderness protocols. Thomas noted in his journal that evening that something felt different about the area, though he couldn't identify what was troubling him. The usual sounds of the Alaskan wilderness seemed muted, almost absent. Even his experienced sled dogs appeared restless throughout the night. The second morning began with an incident that should have served as a warning. Thomas discovered that their food cache, properly secured according to standard bear-proofing protocols, had been disturbed. The damage wasn't consistent with typical wildlife interference. The metal containers showed precise puncture marks, as if something had systematically opened each one. More disturbing was the pattern of consumption. Only specific items had been taken, primarily the high-protein rations, while leaving behind items that any hungry animal would have devoured. Thomas mentioned in his statement that the tracks around the cache were unlike anything he'd encountered in over a decade of guiding. Dr. James insisted they continue with the planned hunt, despite Thomas's growing concerns. They ventured deeper into the wilderness, following what appeared to be fresh caribou tracks through a valley Thomas had never explored before. The landscape itself seemed wrong somehow. Trees that should have been covered in snow stood bare, their branches twisted into unnatural configurations. The frozen ground beneath their feet felt unstable, as if something massive was moving beneath the permafrost. By midday, Thomas realized they were being followed. Initially, he attributed the sensation to typical wilderness paranoia, a common experience when spending extended time in remote areas. However, the feeling persisted and intensified. The dogs began exhibiting signs of extreme distress, whining constantly and refusing to maintain their usual pace. Thomas made the decision to alter their route, taking a longer path back toward their base camp. Whatever was tracking them adjusted its position accordingly, maintaining a consistent distance that suggested intelligence rather than simple animal curiosity. The situation escalated when Dr. James spotted what he believed to be a caribou moving through the trees approximately 300 yards to their northeast. Thomas immediately recognized that the movement pattern was wrong. Caribou don't move with such deliberate, calculated steps, and they certainly don't maintain perfect concealment while doing so. When Dr. James raised his rifle, Thomas physically intervened, explaining that they needed to return to camp immediately. The argument that followed would be the last normal conversation either man would have. As they made their way back through the valley, the landscape began to change in ways that defied explanation. Landmarks that Thomas had carefully noted during their morning journey were no longer where they should have been. Rock formations appeared and disappeared as they moved through the terrain. Most unsettling was the realization that they had been walking for over 4 hours in what should have been a 2-hour return journey. Yet they seemed no closer to their destination. Dr. James began to panic as darkness approached faster than it should have. Thomas consulted his compass repeatedly, finding that the needle spun wildly without settling on any consistent direction. His GPS unit, a relatively new technology in 1987, displayed readings that placed them in impossible locations, sometimes showing coordinates that would put them hundreds of miles from their actual position. The dogs had fallen completely silent, moving forward only when forced, their eyes constantly scanning the surrounding tree line. When they finally reached what appeared to be their base camp, Thomas immediately knew something was fundamentally wrong. The campsite was exactly as they had left it, down to the smallest details. But it was positioned in a location where no camp should exist. According to Thomas's careful navigation notes, they were standing in an area that should have been dense forest. Yet here was their camp, perfectly preserved in a clearing that hadn't existed the day before. Dr. James seemed oblivious to the impossibility of their situation, immediately beginning preparations for the evening meal as if nothing unusual had occurred. Thomas found himself unable to articulate his growing terror. Every rational explanation failed to account for what they were experiencing. He made the decision to attempt radio contact with the outside world, despite the remote location making such communication unlikely. What happened next would haunt Thomas for the remainder of his life. The radio crackled to life immediately, something that should have been impossible given their distance from any repeater stations. The voice that responded to his call was his own voice, speaking words he had never said, describing a situation he wasn't experiencing. The conversation continued for several minutes, with his radio self-discussing weather conditions and location updates that bore no resemblance to their actual circumstances. Dr. James appeared to hear none of this. When Thomas attempted to draw his attention to the radio conversation, the doctor looked at him with complete incomprehension, as if Thomas were speaking a foreign language. The realization that they were no longer experiencing the same reality was more terrifying than any physical threat Thomas had ever encountered. Throughout the night, the impossible continued to manifest. Their campfire burned without consuming fuel, maintaining a constant flame that provided no actual heat. The dogs huddled together in configurations that seemed to shift when observed directly. Most disturbing was the gradual realization that Dr. James was no longer entirely Dr. James. His mannerisms remained familiar, but he began discussing experiences and knowledge that belonged to other people, other lives that Thomas had guided on previous expeditions. When morning arrived, it arrived wrong. The sun appeared in the western sky, casting shadows that fell upward rather than down. Thomas made the desperate decision to abandon their equipment and attempt to return to the highway on foot. Dr. James followed without question, but Thomas noticed that his client cast no shadow despite the impossible sunlight. The journey back to civilization took 3 days that felt like months. Thomas's final radio transmission, recorded by Alaska State Trooper Dispatch at 14:37 hours on November 15th, consisted of screaming followed by silence. He was found 18 hours later, alone, walking along the Richardson Highway near mile marker 201, approximately 16 miles from where his truck was later discovered. Dr. James was never found. No trace of their equipment, the sled dogs, or any evidence of their expedition was ever recovered. Thomas never guided another expedition and left Alaska permanently 6 months after filing his official report. He died in 2003, but not before recording detailed audio testimony that corroborated every element of his original statement. The area near mile marker 185 on the Richardson Highway was quietly designated as restricted access by the Alaska Department of Fish and Game in 1988. The official reason cited unstable geological conditions, but the restriction remains in effect today, nearly 40 years later. Let's move to our second story. This account comes from emergency dispatch recordings dated March 23, 1994, during the spring ice breakup season along the Dalton Highway. The caller was identified as Sarah, a 28-year-old bush pilot contracted by a remote research station approximately 150 miles north of Fairbanks. What makes this case particularly disturbing is that we have the complete audio transcript of her final transmission, recorded in real time as events unfolded. Sarah had been flying supply runs to isolated weather monitoring stations for 6 years, navigating Alaska's most treacherous terrain with a flawless safety record. On the morning of March 23rd, she departed Fairbanks International Airport in her single-engine Cessna 185, loaded with critical medical supplies and communication equipment destined for Research Station Alpha 7. The flight plan indicated a routine 3-hour journey to coordinates that placed the station in one of Alaska's most remote valleys, accessible only by air during the brief spring thaw period. The initial portion of her flight proceeded without incident. Sarah's regular radio check-ins with air traffic control documented normal weather conditions and steady progress along her predetermined route. Her final routine communication occurred at 11:47 a.m., approximately 90 minutes into the flight, when she reported her position as being 23 miles southeast of her destination. The transmission was clear, professional, and gave no indication of any developing problems. What happened during the following 37 minutes remains one of Alaska's most disturbing aviation mysteries. At 12:24 p.m., Sarah initiated contact with emergency dispatch services, and the recording of that conversation would become the subject of intensive investigation by multiple agencies. Her voice, initially calm and controlled, carried an undertone of confusion that would escalate into pure terror over the next 18 minutes. Sarah reported that she had been circling for over an hour, searching for Research Station Alpha 7, but could not locate any trace of the facility. According to her flight instruments, she was positioned directly above the coordinates specified in her flight plan. Yet the landscape below showed no evidence of human presence. More troubling was her observation that the terrain itself didn't match the topographical maps she carried. Valleys appeared where mountains should exist, and mountain ranges rose from areas that should have been flat tundra. The emergency dispatcher, initially attributing her disorientation to typical spring weather conditions, advised Sarah to climb to a higher altitude for better visibility and continue following her instruments to the designated coordinates. Sarah's response revealed a growing panic that something fundamental was wrong with her situation. She reported that her altimeter readings were fluctuating wildly, showing impossible variations in elevation despite maintaining steady flight. Her GPS unit displayed coordinates that placed her simultaneously in multiple locations, sometimes indicating positions hundreds of miles from where she knew herself to be. As the conversation continued, Sarah began describing visual anomalies that challenged every principle of aviation and geography. She reported observing what appeared to be the same geographical features repeatedly, as if she were flying in circles over identical terrain that shouldn't exist in multiple locations. Most disturbing was her observation that the sun seemed to be moving backward across the sky, causing shadows to shift in directions that defied natural law. The emergency dispatcher attempted to guide Sarah through standard disorientation protocols, instructing her to focus on her instruments and ignore visual references that might be deceiving her. Sarah's response indicated that her instruments had become completely unreliable. Her compass spun continuously without settling on any direction. Her fuel gauge showed readings that fluctuated between full and empty, despite her having consumed approximately half her fuel supply. And her radio equipment began picking up transmissions that shouldn't exist. Among the most disturbing elements of the recorded conversation were Sarah's descriptions of radio communications she was receiving from other aircraft. She reported hearing her own voice conducting conversations about flights she had never taken, discussing weather conditions that didn't match her current situation, and communicating with air traffic controllers who were asking about passengers she wasn't carrying. When the emergency dispatcher asked Sarah to switch to an alternative radio frequency, she reported that every frequency contained identical conversations featuring her own voice. As fuel concerns became critical, Sarah attempted to locate any suitable landing area in the increasingly impossible landscape below. She described seeing what appeared to be airstrips and landing fields, but each time she descended for a closer examination, the features would shift or disappear entirely. Runways would appear perfectly maintained from altitude, but reveal themselves as frozen lakes or rocky terrain when approached for landing. The psychological impact of her situation became apparent as Sarah's radio communications became increasingly fragmented and panicked. She reported seeing other aircraft in the distance that appeared to be identical to her own plane, flying in perfect formation with her movements. When she changed direction, the other aircraft adjusted their course accordingly, maintaining precise positioning that suggested they were somehow connected to her actions. Sarah's attempts to establish contact with Research Station Alpha 7 using their designated frequency produced results that defied explanation. The station responded immediately, which should have been impossible given her reported inability to locate the facility visually. The conversation that followed, as recorded by emergency dispatch, featured station personnel discussing her arrival and requesting her estimated landing time, yet they provided no guidance for locating the facility and seemed oblivious to her repeated requests for visual landmarks or runway information. With her fuel supply reaching critical levels, Sarah made the decision to attempt an emergency landing on what appeared to be a frozen lake, approximately 15 miles east of her supposed position. Her descent toward the landing site revealed that the lake's surface was not frozen, but rather covered with a substance that resembled ice, yet moved like liquid. As she pulled up to avoid the impossible terrain, her engine began experiencing power fluctuations that her training couldn't explain. The final portion of Sarah's transmission documented a complete breakdown of both mechanical systems and natural law. Her engine alternated between running normally and complete silence, yet the aircraft continued flying regardless of engine status. Her control surfaces responded to inputs in reverse, with the aircraft climbing when she pushed the nose down and descending when she pulled back on the controls. Most terrifying was her report that the landscape below had begun rotating independently of her aircraft's movement. creating a disorienting visual effect that made navigation impossible. Sarah's last coherent transmission occurred at 12:42 p.m., approximately 18 minutes after her initial emergency call. She reported that she could see Research Station Alpha 7 directly below her aircraft, exactly where it should be according to her flight plan. Yet, her instruments indicated she was flying over empty wilderness. The station appeared fully operational with personnel moving about the facility, but they cast no shadows despite the bright spring sunlight. As Sarah began her final approach to the station's runway, her voice became increasingly distorted over the radio, as if the transmission itself was being altered by some external force. She reported that the runway appeared normal from her perspective, but her instruments showed her descending toward solid rock. The contradiction between visual and instrument references reached a peak as she committed to the landing approach. The emergency dispatch recording captured Sarah's final words at 12:43 p.m. "I can see them waving at me from the ground, but my altimeter shows I'm still at 3,000 feet. The runway looks perfect, but something's wrong with..." The transmission ended abruptly with a sound that investigators described as resembling electronic interference rather than any mechanical failure or impact. Search and rescue operations commenced immediately, with multiple aircraft dispatched to Sarah's last known coordinates. Despite extensive aerial and ground searches covering over 500 square miles of terrain, no trace of Sarah, her aircraft, or any wreckage was ever discovered. Research Station Alpha 7 reported no communication with any incoming aircraft on March 23rd and maintained that no supply deliveries were scheduled for that date. The investigation revealed that Research Station Alpha 7 had been permanently abandoned 18 months prior to Sarah's disappearance, following a series of unexplained incidents that resulted in the facility being declared unsafe for human occupation. Official records indicated that the station's coordinates had been removed from all active flight plans in September 1992. Yet Sarah's flight documentation clearly showed the facility as an active destination. Sarah's Cessna 185 remains missing, and she is officially listed as disappeared under unknown circumstances. The 18-minute emergency dispatch recording is the only evidence of what occurred during her final flight. The Federal Aviation Administration quietly restricted all aircraft access to the coordinates of the former Research Station Alpha 7, citing environmental concerns that have never been publicly detailed. Let's move to our third story. This account comes from detailed psychiatric evaluation transcripts dated August 14, 2003, recorded at Providence, Alaska Medical Center in Anchorage. The subject was Maria, a 42-year-old environmental research scientist who had been found walking along the park's highway in a state of complete psychological collapse. Her case file remains classified, but leaked portions of her testimony reveal an encounter that fundamentally challenges our understanding of Alaska's wilderness areas. Maria had been conducting water quality assessments for the Environmental Protection Agency, specifically examining the effects of climate change on remote lake systems throughout central Alaska. She was considered one of the leading experts in Arctic environmental science, with over 15 years of fieldwork experience in some of the world's most inhospitable regions. Her reputation for methodical documentation and rational analysis made her subsequent testimony all the more disturbing to the medical professionals who treated her. On August 9, 2003, Maria departed Anchorage alone in a rented SUV, heading north on the park's highway toward Denali National Park. Her research target was an unnamed lake system approximately 37 miles west of the highway, accessible only through unmarked wilderness trails that required advanced navigation skills. The lake had been selected for study due to satellite imagery showing unusual algae blooms that didn't match typical patterns for the region's climate conditions. According to Maria's fragmented recollections, the drive to her access point proceeded normally until she reached mile marker 237, where she was scheduled to turn onto a logging road that would take her within hiking distance of the lake system. The road appeared exactly as described in her research documentation, but as she drove deeper into the forest, the landscape began to exhibit characteristics that contradicted both her topographical maps and her extensive knowledge of Alaskan geography. Maria reported that after driving for approximately 45 minutes on what should have been a 20-minute journey, she encountered terrain that shouldn't exist in that region. Dense tropical vegetation appeared alongside Arctic trees, creating impossible ecological combinations that violated every principle of environmental science she understood. More disturbing was the presence of animal species that had no business existing in Alaska, including what appeared to be large primates moving through the canopy above her vehicle. When Maria finally reached what she believed to be her designated parking area, she discovered that the lake system she had come to study was not a lake at all, but rather a perfectly circular clearing filled with a substance that resembled water, but behaved unlike any liquid she had encountered. The surface reflected light in patterns that hurt to observe directly, and when she tested the substance with her scientific instruments, the readings defied physical laws. The pH measurements fluctuated wildly without any apparent cause, and temperature readings showed simultaneous hot and cold zones within the same sample. As a trained scientist, Maria attempted to document these anomalies using her digital camera and data collection equipment. However, every photograph she took showed only normal forest scenery, despite her clearly observing the impossible landscape through her own eyes. Her environmental sensors recorded standard readings for a typical Alaskan wilderness area, contradicting what she was experiencing firsthand. The disconnect between her observations and her instruments created a cognitive dissonance that began to affect her psychological stability. Maria decided to establish her base camp approximately 100 yards from the circular clearing, following standard research protocols despite the increasingly surreal circumstances. As she set up her equipment, she became aware that she was being observed by something large moving through the forest around her campsite. Unlike typical Alaskan wildlife, whatever was watching her maintained a constant distance and seemed to anticipate her movements, always positioning itself just beyond her visual range. The first night passed without incident, though Maria reported that the usual sounds of Alaskan wilderness were completely absent. No bird calls, no insects, no wind through the trees. The silence was so complete that she could hear her own heartbeat echoing through the forest, as if the sound were being amplified by some external source. Her sleep was disrupted by dreams that felt more real than her waking experiences, featuring conversations with people she had never met about scientific discoveries that contradicted established knowledge. On the second day, Maria began collecting samples from the mysterious circular clearing, despite her instrument's inability to provide coherent readings. The substance that appeared to be water had a consistency that changed based on her method of interaction. When she dipped containers into it, the material behaved like normal liquid. But when she attempted to wade into it, her feet encountered solid resistance, as if walking on concrete. Most disturbing was the substance's apparent awareness of her presence, forming shapes and patterns that seemed designed to communicate with her. As Maria worked, she began to notice that her own reflection in the liquid surface was behaving independently. Her reflection would move when she remained still, perform actions she wasn't taking, and at times appeared to be trying to communicate with her through gestures and expressions. When she attempted to photograph this phenomenon, her camera showed only normal reflections. Yet the independent behavior continued when observed directly. The psychological strain of documenting scientifically impossible phenomena began to affect Maria's cognitive functions. She found herself taking detailed notes about observations that her instruments couldn't verify, creating a research record that contradicted itself on multiple levels. Her training demanded empirical verification, but her direct experience provided evidence that her instruments refused to acknowledge. The conflict between scientific methodology and impossible reality created a mental stress that manifested in physical symptoms. On the third day, Maria encountered what she described as other researchers working in the area. These individuals appeared to be conducting similar environmental studies, using equipment identical to her own, and seemed familiar with her research objectives. However, their presence made no logical sense, as Maria had received exclusive access permits for the area, and no other research projects were scheduled for the region. More disturbing was her gradual realization that these other researchers were conducting studies on her rather than the environment. The other researchers engaged Maria in detailed scientific discussions about her work, displaying knowledge of her research that they couldn't possibly possess. They presented findings from the lake system that contradicted her observations, yet their data appeared more scientifically valid than her own impossible measurements. As the conversations continued, Maria began to question whether her own observations were accurate, or whether she was experiencing some form of psychological breakdown induced by isolation. When Maria attempted to leave the research site on the fourth day, she discovered that her vehicle would not start despite showing no mechanical problems. Her radio equipment, which had been functioning normally, now received only transmissions featuring her own voice, conducting interviews about research she had never performed. The GPS system in her vehicle displayed coordinates that placed her in multiple locations simultaneously, none of which matched her actual position according to her maps. The final documented event occurred on the fifth day, when Maria reported that the mysterious lake began to drain away, revealing a perfectly preserved research station beneath its surface. The facility appeared to be an exact replica of laboratories where she had previously worked, complete with her own research data and personal belongings that she clearly remembered leaving in Anchorage. The other researchers invited her to join them in the underground facility, explaining that her real work was just beginning. Maria's memory becomes fragmented at this point in her testimony. She recalled descending into the underground laboratory, finding research equipment more advanced than anything she had seen before, and beginning work on projects that seemed familiar yet impossible. The other researchers explained that time operated differently in the facility, and that her surface world experiences had been necessary preparation for the real research that awaited her below. The next clear memory Maria retained was walking along the park's highway, discovered by passing motorists who reported her incoherent and apparently suffering from exposure. She had no recollection of how she returned to the highway or what happened to her research equipment and vehicle. Search teams found her abandoned SUV 48 miles north of where she was discovered, with all her scientific equipment missing and no signs of mechanical failure. Maria's psychological evaluation revealed no evidence of substance abuse or pre-existing mental health conditions that could account for her experiences. However, the detailed consistency of her impossible observations, combined with her professional credibility as a scientist, made her case one of the most thoroughly documented, unexplained incidents in Alaska's psychiatric medical records. She never returned to fieldwork and retired from environmental research 6 months after her evaluation. The lake system Maria was investigating was quietly removed from all EPA research schedules following her disappearance. Satellite imagery of the area now shows only typical forest coverage, with no evidence of the water features that originally drew scientific interest. Let's move to our fourth story. This case originates from dashcam footage recovered by Alaska State Police on September 18, 2023, during the height of fall hunting season. The vehicle belonged to Robert, a 31-year-old delivery driver for a medical supply company based in Fairbanks. What makes this incident particularly chilling is that we have continuous video documentation of events that unfolded over a 17-hour period. Yet the footage reveals circumstances that should be physically impossible to record or survive. Robert had been working delivery routes throughout northern Alaska for 8 years, specializing in transporting critical medical supplies to remote communities and research facilities scattered across the wilderness. His route on September 17, 2023, was routine, involving deliveries to 3 small villages along the Stees Highway before returning to Fairbanks. The final delivery was scheduled for Circle, a community of approximately 100 residents located at mile marker 162, approximately 6 hours from his starting point. Weather forecasts indicated clear conditions with temperatures expected to remain above freezing, making for ideal driving conditions during the brief autumn window before winter isolation set in. Robert's dashcam automatically activated when he started his delivery van at 6:23 a.m., documenting what initially appeared to be a standard workday. The early footage shows him following his usual pre-departure checklist, loading medical supplies into temperature-controlled storage compartments, and reviewing delivery schedules with dispatch personnel. His demeanor was professional and relaxed, showing no indication of the terror that would consume him within the next few hours. The timestamp on the footage corresponds exactly to dispatch records, confirming the authenticity of what would become one of Alaska's most disturbing pieces of evidence. The first 3 hours of Robert's journey proceeded exactly as expected, with dashcam footage documenting familiar landscapes and routine traffic interactions along the Stees Highway. Robert maintained regular radio contact with his dispatcher, providing location updates and estimated arrival times that matched his progress perfectly. The video shows him stopping at the Central Roadhouse at mile marker 137 for a scheduled break, interacting normally with staff members who later confirmed his presence and typical behavior during the brief stop. His conversations with the dispatcher, audible on the dashcam audio, revealed nothing unusual about his mental state or observations of the route. The anomalous events began approximately 20 minutes after Robert departed Central. As he approached mile marker 145, the dashcam footage shows the landscape ahead suddenly becoming obscured by what appears to be an impossibly thick fog bank that extends across the entire highway. What makes this phenomenon disturbing is that the fog appears to have distinct boundaries, creating a wall of white vapor that the vehicle approaches but never seems to penetrate. Robert's voice can be heard on the audio commenting about the unusual weather. Yet, meteorological records from the National Weather Service indicate perfectly clear conditions throughout the entire region during this time period. As Robert's vehicle enters the fog bank, the dashcam records a disorienting sequence, where the highway ahead becomes visible and invisible in rapid alternation, as if the fog is pulsing or breathing around the vehicle. More disturbing is Robert's growing confusion about his location. As familiar landmarks disappear and are replaced by geographical features that shouldn't exist in this region of Alaska, the GPS system in his vehicle begins displaying error messages, showing coordinates that place him simultaneously in multiple locations across North America, with readings fluctuating between his expected position and locations as far away as northern Canada and the Pacific Northwest. Within the fog, Robert encounters other vehicles that appear to be traveling the same route, yet their presence makes no logical sense. The dashcam records clear images of cars and trucks maintaining normal highway speeds in both directions, despite visibility conditions that should make such driving impossible. When Robert attempts to signal or communicate with these other drivers, they show no awareness of his presence, continuing to drive as if following predetermined routes through the impenetrable fog. Most disturbing is his observation that several of the vehicles appear to be identical to his own delivery van, complete with the same company logos and license plates, as if multiple versions of himself are traveling the same impossible road. As the dashcam continues recording, Robert's voice reveals mounting panic as he realizes that he has been driving through the fog bank for over 2 hours without emerging on the other side. According to his vehicle's odometer, he has traveled nearly 100 miles. Yet the fog conditions remain constant and the highway stretches endlessly ahead without any signs of approaching clear weather. His radio attempts to contact dispatch result in receiving his own voice, responding from what appears to be previous conversations, creating an audio loop where Robert finds himself arguing with recordings of his earlier transmissions. The dashcam footage reveals that Robert's fuel gauge, which should be approaching half empty after 3 hours of driving, instead displays a reading that remains mysteriously full, despite the engine running continuously. When Robert pulls over to check his fuel tank physically, the dashcam captures him discovering that the fuel cap appears to have been sealed shut with a substance that looks like ice, but feels warm to the touch. His attempts to remove the seal result in the substance instantly reforming, as if the vehicle is maintaining its fuel supply through some impossible mechanism. During his 4th hour in the fog, Robert encounters what he describes as service stations that appear along the highway at regular intervals. The dashcam footage shows these facilities clearly, complete with working gas pumps, illuminated signs, and what appear to be attendants moving about the premises. However, when Robert stops at these stations, the attendants ignore his presence entirely, continuing to service other vehicles that arrived before him. Most disturbing is his realization that the other customers at these impossible gas stations are also identical versions of himself, all driving the same delivery van and wearing the same uniform. The psychological strain begins affecting Robert's behavior as recorded by the dashcam audio. His radio communications become increasingly fragmented and desperate as he attempts to explain his situation to dispatchers who seem to be hearing completely different conversations. The video captures Robert repeatedly checking his mirrors, not for traffic safety, but because he reports seeing additional versions of his own vehicle following at precise distances behind him. When he slows down, they slow down. When he accelerates, they match his speed exactly, maintaining a convoy of identical vehicles that shouldn't exist. As darkness approaches, which occurs much earlier than it should according to the season and location, Robert's dashcam captures the impossible sight of streetlights illuminating the highway through the fog. These lights appear in perfect sequence, stretching as far as the camera can record. Yet no such lighting infrastructure exists along this remote section of the Steese Highway. The lights cast shadows that fall in multiple directions simultaneously, creating visual contradictions that hurt to observe directly. Robert's commentary becomes increasingly incoherent as he struggles to describe what he's seeing while maintaining his sanity. The overnight portion of the dashcam recording documents Robert's decision to continue driving rather than stop in the impossible landscape. His reasoning, captured clearly on audio, is that stopping might somehow make his situation permanent. While continuing to move forward, offers the possibility of eventually emerging from whatever phenomenon has trapped him. The footage shows him consuming food and water from his emergency supplies. Yet, his consumption appears to have no effect on the quantities available, as if the supplies are replenishing themselves automatically. During the early morning hours, Robert encounters what the dash cam records as construction zones within the fog, complete with orange cones, warning signs, and construction workers directing traffic. These workers wave Robert through the work areas using standard hand signals. Yet their faces appear to be identical to his own face, creating a workforce of Roberts managing road construction that shouldn't exist on a highway he can't escape. The construction equipment visible in the footage includes machinery that appears to be building additional lanes of the same highway, extending the impossible road system deeper into the fog. Robert's breaking point occurs approximately 14 hours into the ordeal, when his dashcam captures him screaming at his own reflection in the rearview mirror, which appears to be responding with different facial expressions and gestures. The reflection begins pointing towards something behind the vehicle, causing Robert to constantly check his mirrors and observe the convoy of identical delivery vans that continue following him through the endless fog. His radio communications deteriorate into pleas for help, directed at dispatchers who respond with his own voice, providing routine status updates from deliveries he completed months earlier. The final hours of dashcam footage document Robert's gradual acceptance that he may be trapped permanently in the fog-covered highway system. His voice becomes calm and detached as he begins describing his experience like a clinical report, noting details about the impossible infrastructure, the behavior of other travelers, and the consistent environmental conditions that never change despite the passage of time. He begins addressing the camera directly, explaining what happened for anyone who might find the footage, though he expresses doubt that anyone outside the fog will ever see his recording. The dashcam recording ends abruptly at 17:43, exactly 17 hours after Robert entered the fog bank, near mile marker 145. The final frame shows the fog beginning to thin ahead of the vehicle, revealing what appears to be normal highway and clear skies. Robert was found 6 hours later by Alaska State Police, parked safely at a rest area near mile marker 162. Exactly where he should have arrived, according to his original delivery schedule. He had no memory of the fog encounter and insisted that his journey had been routine and uneventful. The medical supplies in Robert's delivery van were found to have been delivered successfully, with signed receipts from all 3 villages along his route, despite no record of his arrival at any of these locations. The dashcam footage was the only evidence that anything unusual had occurred during his 17-hour disappearance. Robert resigned from his delivery position within a week of the incident and has refused all requests to discuss the events captured on the recording. Alaska State Police have classified the dashcam footage, and the stretch of highway between mile markers 140 and 150 on the Stees Highway has been designated for enhanced monitoring by transportation authorities. Official weather records continue to show no fog activity in the region on September 17, 2023. It's moved to our 5th story. This account comes from multiple witness testimonies and medical examiner reports filed between October 12th and October 19th, 2024, following what officials initially classified as a group hiking accident in the remote wilderness area south of Denali National Park. The incident involved 5 college students from the University of Alaska Fairbanks who had planned a week-long camping expedition to celebrate their upcoming graduation. What makes this case particularly disturbing is that we have detailed testimonies from 3 survivors. Yet their accounts describe events so contradictory and impossible that investigators have been unable to determine what actually occurred during those 7 days in the wilderness. The group consisted of Jennifer, a 22-year-old environmental science major who organized the expedition; Kevin, a 24-year-old geology student with extensive backcountry experience; Lisa, a 19-year-old psychology major on her first major camping trip; Michael, a 23-year-old biology student and experienced outdoorsman; and Amanda, a 21-year-old anthropology major who served as the group's photographer and documentarian. They departed Fairbanks on October 12th in Kevin's modified SUV. Equipped with professional-grade camping gear and enough supplies for 10 days in case of emergency, their planned route would take them through some of Alaska's most spectacular but remote wilderness areas, accessible only through unmarked trails that required advanced navigation skills and wilderness experience. According to multiple witnesses at the Talkeetna Ranger Station, the group appeared well prepared and in excellent spirits when they completed their permit paperwork and received their final weather briefing. The forecast indicated stable conditions with clear skies expected throughout their planned expedition dates. Jennifer had submitted a detailed itinerary that included specific GPS coordinates for each planned campsite, with daily check-in times scheduled via satellite communicator. Kevin's wilderness experience and the group's high-quality equipment satisfied all ranger requirements for backcountry permits in the designated area. The initial 3 days of their expedition proceeded according to plan, with regular check-ins confirming their progress along the predetermined route. Amanda's digital photography documented typical camping activities, group meals, and spectacular wilderness scenery that matched their expected locations. The satellite communicator messages indicated normal group dynamics, with everyone adapting well to backcountry conditions despite Lisa's inexperience with wilderness camping. Jennifer's leadership and Kevin's technical expertise appeared to be managing the expedition effectively, with no reported conflicts or equipment problems. The first indication that something was wrong occurred on October 16th, when the group failed to make their scheduled evening check-in via satellite communicator. Search and rescue protocols allow for 12 hours of communication delays due to equipment problems or weather conditions. But when no contact was established by the following afternoon, emergency response procedures were initiated. The Alaska State Troopers dispatched a search helicopter to the group's last known coordinates, expecting to find minor equipment failures or weather-related delays that would require routine assistance. What the search team discovered defied explanation and violated every principle of wilderness search and rescue operations. The helicopter crew located the group's campsite exactly where it should be, according to their itinerary. But the scene they observed made no logical sense. 3 of the 5 tents were set up normally and appeared to be occupied, while 2 tents were positioned in locations that should have been impossible to access without specialized climbing equipment. More disturbing was the observation that smoke was rising from what appeared to be multiple campfires, suggesting the group had somehow established several separate camps within the same small area. When the helicopter attempted to land near the campsite, the crew reported experiencing severe equipment malfunctions that forced them to abort the landing approach. The aircraft's altimeter displayed readings that contradicted visual observation, showing the helicopter at ground level while clearly flying several hundred feet above the terrain. Radio communication with the group resulted in responses that seemed to come from different locations simultaneously, with voices echoing as if transmitted from underground caverns rather than open wilderness. Ground-based search and rescue teams reached the coordinates on foot approximately 6 hours after the failed helicopter landing. What they discovered was a campsite that appeared to have been occupied by far more than 5 people. with evidence of multiple camps established over what appeared to be several weeks rather than 4 days. Equipment was scattered across a much larger area than any group of 5 people could reasonably manage, including gear that didn't match the inventory the students had signed out from the university's outdoor program. The 3 surviving members of the group were found in conditions that medical professionals struggled to explain. Jennifer was discovered approximately 2 miles from the main campsite, suffering from severe hypothermia, despite wearing appropriate cold weather gear and having access to functioning warming equipment. Her condition suggested exposure to extreme cold for an extended period, yet weather records indicated temperatures had remained well above freezing throughout their expedition. More disturbing was her insistence that she had been separated from the group for days or maybe weeks, despite the timeline indicating she could have been alone for no more than 18 hours. Kevin was found at the original campsite, apparently, maintaining 3 separate campfires simultaneously, while claiming he was trying to signal for help. His behavior was described as manic and disoriented, with him repeatedly counting group members and becoming increasingly agitated when unable to account for all 5 people. Medical examination revealed signs of severe sleep deprivation. Yet, Kevin insisted he had been sleeping normally and couldn't understand why rescuers were suggesting he appeared exhausted. Most troubling was his detailed description of group conversations and activities that allegedly occurred after Jennifer had been found missing. Lisa was discovered in her tent, conscious and responsive, but exhibiting symptoms of psychological trauma that typically develop over much longer periods than the 4 days she had been in the wilderness. Her detailed recollections of the expedition included events that contradicted both the timeline and the accounts provided by Jennifer and Kevin. She described participating in group activities with all 5 members present during the same time period that the others claimed Jennifer was missing. Her photographic equipment contained images that appeared to document a much longer expedition, with seasonal changes visible in the background scenery that couldn't have occurred during their brief trip. The search for Michael and Amanda continued for 5 additional days, expanding to cover over 50 square miles of wilderness terrain. Despite extensive aerial and ground searches involving multiple agencies and volunteer groups, no trace of either missing student was ever discovered. More disturbing was the discovery that their personal effects, including identification, clothing, and specialized equipment, were found distributed throughout the expanded search area in patterns that suggested they had been camping in multiple locations simultaneously. During the extended search operations, rescue teams documented several anomalies that complicated their efforts and challenged standard search protocols. Equipment failures occurred with unusual frequency, including GPS devices displaying impossible coordinates and radio communications that seemed to echo from locations where no search teams were present. Multiple teams reported observing what appeared to be additional campsites and fire rings in areas they had previously searched thoroughly, as if new camps were appearing overnight in locations that had been confirmed empty. The psychological evaluation of the 3 survivors revealed consistent but contradictory memories of their expedition that defied rational explanation. All 3 provided detailed, coherent accounts of events that couldn't have occurred according to the established timeline. Yet each displayed genuine conviction about the accuracy of their memories. Jennifer insisted that Michael and Amanda had been with the group when she was found, participating in her rescue and expressing concern about her condition. Kevin maintained detailed memories of conversations with all 5 group members during periods when Jennifer was confirmed to be missing and Lisa was documented as being alone in her tent. Most disturbing were Lisa's photographic records, which appeared to document impossible events with technical precision that ruled out manipulation or fraud. Images showed all 5 group members participating in activities during time periods when at least 2 members were confirmed to be missing. The metadata embedded in the digital files confirmed the images were captured with Lisa's camera during the expedition dates. Yet the content depicted scenarios that violated the established facts of the case. Weather conditions, lighting, and seasonal indicators visible in the photographs contradicted meteorological records and satellite imagery from the same time periods. The investigation expanded to include examination of the group's digital communications, social media activity, and electronic device records from before, during, and after the expedition. What investigators discovered added additional layers of impossibility to an already incomprehensible case. Social media posts appeared to have been made from wilderness locations during the expedition, showing all 5 group members together and describing activities that extended far beyond their planned 7-day timeline. These posts were made from devices that were later found to be powered off or destroyed, using internet connectivity that shouldn't exist in their remote location. Medical examination of the survivors' physical condition provided additional evidence that their experience couldn't be explained by a standard 4-day camping trip. All 3 showed signs of prolonged wilderness exposure, including muscle development and conditioning changes that typically require weeks or months of intensive outdoor activity. Dietary analysis suggested they had consumed a much more varied wilderness diet than their planned provisions would allow, including foods that don't grow naturally in Alaska during October. Most significantly, all 3 tested positive for mineral and chemical traces that are found only in specific geological regions of Alaska, none of which were within hundreds of miles of their documented expedition route. The case was officially closed after 6 months of investigation, with Michael and Amanda declared missing under circumstances that remain unexplained. The 3 survivors were cleared of any involvement in their friend's disappearance, as physical evidence conclusively demonstrated they couldn't have been responsible for concealing bodies or fabricating evidence across such a vast wilderness area. However, none of the 3 has been willing to participate in follow-up interviews or return to wilderness areas since their rescue. The specific coordinates where the group established their initial campsite have been quietly removed from backcountry permit systems, with the area now designated as temporarily unavailable for recreational use due to unspecified environmental concerns. University of Alaska Fairbanks discontinued their outdoor programs equipment lending program for that region, citing budget constraints that have never been publicly detailed. The search and rescue teams who participated in the operation have reported an unusually high rate of early retirement and career changes in the months following the incident. The families of Michael and Amanda continue to fund private search efforts, but no professional search and rescue organization has agreed to operate in the specific area where the group established their campsite. Official records indicate that over 24 separate search operations have been proposed for the area, but all have been canceled due to equipment failures during planning stages that investigators cannot explain. Let's move to our 6th story. This account comes from a joint psychological evaluation conducted at the Alaska Psychiatric Institute on June 25, 2022, involving a married couple who had been found wandering separately along the Glen Highway after what was supposed to be their 15th wedding anniversary celebration. Mark, a 45-year-old construction supervisor, and Rachel, a 43-year-old elementary school teacher, had planned a romantic weekend retreat at a remote cabin rental near Sheep Mountain Lodge, approximately 100 miles northeast of Anchorage. What makes their case extraordinary is that both provide detailed, consistent accounts of the same impossible events. Yet their testimonies describe experiences that violate fundamental laws of physics and human psychology. Mark and Rachel had been experiencing marital difficulties for several months prior to their anniversary trip. primarily due to work-related stress and the challenges of raising two teenage children while maintaining their relationship. The anniversary weekend was intended as an opportunity to reconnect and address their communication problems in a peaceful setting away from daily responsibilities. Rachel had researched cabin rentals extensively, selecting a property that promised complete isolation and spectacular mountain views. Perfect for the intimate conversations they needed to have about their marriage's future. The cabin reservation was confirmed through a legitimate rental agency that specialized in remote Alaska properties. With Rachel paying a substantial deposit for a 3-day rental beginning. June 23, 2022. The property was described as a fully equipped log cabin with modern amenities, located approximately 12 miles off the Glen Highway via a well-maintained gravel road. GPS coordinates were provided, along with detailed driving directions and emergency contact information for the property management company. Weather forecasts indicated ideal conditions with clear skies and temperatures in the comfortable range for late June in south-central Alaska. Mark and Rachel departed Anchorage on the morning of June 23rd in Rachel's SUV, both expressing optimism about the trip during their final phone call to their children, who were staying with Rachel's sister for the weekend. The drive along the Glen Highway proceeded normally, with the couple stopping at the Sheep Mountain Lodge for lunch and to confirm directions to their rental cabin. Lodge staff later verified that both Mark and Rachel appeared relaxed and happy during their brief visit, discussing their excitement about their anniversary celebration and plans for hiking in the surrounding wilderness areas. According to their joint testimony, the couple located the gravel access road exactly where the rental agency's directions indicated it should be, marked with a small wooden sign bearing the cabin's rental number. The 12-mile drive through increasingly remote wilderness brought them to a clearing where a beautiful log cabin stood exactly as described in the rental listing, complete with a wraparound porch, stone fireplace chimney, and panoramic views of the surrounding mountain ranges. Both Mark and Rachel emphasized their immediate impression that the property exceeded their expectations and seemed perfect for their romantic reunion. The first evening at the cabin proceeded according to their plans, with the couple preparing a romantic dinner using supplies they had brought from Anchorage and enjoying wine while watching the sunset from the cabin's porch. Mark reported that Rachel seemed more relaxed than she had been in months, and Rachel noted that Mark appeared genuinely interested in discussing their relationship challenges without the defensive attitudes that had characterized their recent conversations. They spent several hours talking honestly about their marriage, their individual needs, and their hopes for rebuilding their connection. The anomalous events began during their second night at the cabin, when both Mark and Rachel were awakened simultaneously by what they described as the sound of their own voices having a conversation outside the cabin. When they looked through the windows, they could clearly see two figures on the porch who appeared to be identical to themselves, engaged in an animated discussion about topics they had never discussed. The figures were wearing clothes that neither Mark nor Rachel recognized. Yet the voices were unmistakably their own, speaking with emotional intensity about experiences that didn't match their actual lives. Mark initially attempted to rationalize the experience as a shared dream or hallucination brought on by the stress they had been experiencing. But Rachel insisted they investigate the phenomenon together. When they opened the cabin door to confront the figures on the porch, they found the area completely empty, with no signs that anyone had been present. However, the conversation they had been hearing continued, now seeming to emanate from multiple locations around the cabin simultaneously, as if several versions of themselves were having different discussions in the surrounding forest. Throughout the remainder of that night, Mark and Rachel documented increasingly impossible experiences that they both witnessed with identical clarity and detail. The cabin appeared to expand and contract around them, with rooms becoming larger or smaller based on their emotional state during their ongoing conversations about their marriage. When they discussed positive memories from their relationship, the cabin felt warm and spacious. When they addressed painful issues or conflicts, the walls seemed to close in and the temperature dropped noticeably. The following morning brought no relief from the psychological strain of their experience. Mark and Rachel discovered that their cell phones were receiving text messages from each other, despite both devices being in the same room and acting, neither person sending any messages. The texts contained intimate communications about their relationship that reflected thoughts and feelings neither had previously expressed. Yet the content was unmistakably in their individual writing styles and referenced private experiences that only they would know. More disturbing was their gradual realization that time was behaving inconsistently within the cabin environment. Conversations that felt like brief discussions would be revealed by their watches to have lasted several hours, while activities that seemed to consume entire afternoons would show only minutes of elapsed time. The sun's position in the sky bore no relationship to the time displayed on their devices, creating a disorienting environment where their internal sense of time became completely unreliable. During what they believed to be their third day at the cabin, Mark and Rachel began encountering other versions of themselves at different stages of their relationship. They reported having detailed conversations with younger versions of themselves from their early marriage, who provided advice about avoiding the mistakes that had led to their current marital problems. These younger selves appeared completely real and interactive, possessing accurate memories of experiences that the current Mark and Rachel had shared years earlier. Simultaneously, they encountered older versions of themselves who appeared to represent possible futures for their relationship. Some of these future selves were happily married couples who had successfully resolved their current conflicts, while others appeared to be divorced or estranged. Warning about the consequences of failing to address their communication problems. The emotional impact of these encounters was profound, forcing Mark and Rachel to confront the full spectrum of potential outcomes for their marriage. The psychological pressure of experiencing multiple timelines and versions of their relationship simultaneously began affecting their ability to distinguish between their actual memories and the experiences they were having at the cabin. Rachel reported becoming confused about which conversations had actually occurred between them and which had involved their alternate selves. Mark struggled to maintain his sense of identity as he interacted with versions of himself who had made different life choices and developed different personalities. The situation reached a crisis point when Mark and Rachel realized they were no longer certain which version of themselves was real. The cabin contained evidence of multiple simultaneous occupancies, with personal belongings that belonged to them yet which they didn't remember bringing, and photographs showing them in locations they had never visited. Their own reflections in the cabin's mirrors began showing them at different ages and in different clothing, creating a visual confirmation that their reality had become fundamentally unstable. Their escape from the cabin occurred when both Mark and Rachel simultaneously decided they needed to leave immediately, regardless of the consequences for their relationship or their understanding of what they had experienced. When they attempted to pack their belongings, they discovered that their possessions had multiplied, with duplicate and triplicate versions of their clothes, toiletries, and personal items filling the cabin, as if multiple versions of themselves had been staying there concurrently. The drive away from the cabin proved as disorienting as their stay had been. Mark, who was driving, reported that the 12-mile gravel road had somehow become much longer, requiring several hours to reach the Glen Highway despite maintaining normal driving speeds. Rachel observed that the landscape they passed through during their departure was different from what they had seen when arriving, featuring geographical formations and vegetation that didn't match the area's typical characteristics. When they finally reached the Glen Highway, both Mark and Rachel discovered they were completely lost, unable to determine their location or direction despite being on a familiar road they had traveled many times. Their GPS devices displayed coordinates that placed them in impossible locations, sometimes showing them to be hundreds of miles from Alaska entirely. Their fuel gauge, which should have been nearly empty after the extended drive, showed a full tank despite no memory of stopping for gas. The psychological aftermath of their experience manifested differently for each of them during the drive back toward Anchorage. Mark became increasingly agitated and paranoid, convinced that the other drivers on the highway were somehow connected to the alternate versions of themselves they had encountered at the cabin. Rachel experienced episodes of dissociation, reporting that she felt like she was observing someone else's life rather than living her own experiences. Their separation occurred approximately 50 miles apart along the Glen Highway, though neither could explain how they became separated or why they had left the vehicle. Mark was found by Alaska state troopers walking eastbound near mile marker 102, claiming he was trying to return to the cabin to retrieve Rachel, who he insisted was still there despite having clear memories of leaving together. Rachel was discovered walking westbound near mile marker 52, seeking help for Mark, who she believed had remained at the cabin after an argument about whether their experiences had been real. Both Mark and Rachel were transported to medical facilities for evaluation, during which their individual accounts of the anniversary trip proved to be remarkably consistent despite their spatial and temporal separation. Medical examination revealed no evidence of drug use, alcohol intoxication, or pre-existing mental health conditions that could account for their shared delusions. However, both showed signs of severe psychological trauma typically associated with much longer periods of isolation and stress than their supposed 3-day trip would allow. The investigation into their experience revealed that no cabin rental existed at the coordinates they provided, and the gravel road they described accessing was found to be a dead-end logging road that hadn't been maintained for over a decade. The rental agency Rachel claimed to have used had no record of any transaction or communication with her, despite her bank statements showing a payment for the exact amount she claimed to have paid for the cabin rental. Mark and Rachel's marriage, ironically, was strengthened by their shared impossible experience. Their joint psychological evaluation revealed that confronting alternate versions of their relationship had provided them with insights into their communication problems and potential solutions that conventional marriage counseling had failed to achieve. However, both have refused to discuss specific details of their conversations with their alternate selves, maintaining that some aspects of their experience are too personal to share even with mental health professionals. The coordinates where Mark and Rachel claim to have stayed have been investigated by multiple agencies, but no evidence of any structure or human habitation has ever been found. The area remains accessible to hikers and campers, but the Alaska Department of Natural Resources has noted an unusually high rate of reports involving disorientation and communication equipment failures in that specific region since June 2022. Let's move to our 7th story. This account comes from multiple witness testimonies and medical examiner reports filed throughout December 2025, following what the Alaska Department of Public Safety classified as a mass psychological incident affecting the entire population of Coldfoot, a small community of 47 residents located along the Dalton Highway. What makes this case unprecedented is that every adult resident of the town reported identical experiences over a 7-day period. Yet physical evidence contradicts their collective testimony in ways that challenge our understanding of shared reality and mass psychological phenomena. Coldfoot serves as the last major supply stop before the Prudhoe Bay oil fields, functioning primarily as a truck stop and services hub for the industrial traffic traveling the Dalton Highway. The community operates year-round despite extreme winter conditions, with most residents employed either by the truck stop facility, the local post office, or the small medical clinic that serves the northern region of the highway. The town's isolation and harsh climate create tight-knit community bonds among residents who depend on each other for survival during the months of winter darkness. The incident began on December 15, 2025, when the entire population of Coldfoot simultaneously reported hearing what they described as construction sounds coming from beneath the town. These sounds, which residents characterized as heavy machinery operating underground, continued constantly for 6 days without pause. What makes this phenomenon impossible is that geological surveys of the area show solid permafrost extending hundreds of feet below the surface, making any underground construction physically impossible with current technology. Every adult resident provided nearly identical descriptions of the underground activity, reporting the sounds of multiple bulldozers, excavators, and dump trucks operating in coordinated patterns that suggested large-scale construction projects. The consistency of their testimonies was remarkable, with residents independently providing detailed specifications about equipment types, work schedules, and operational patterns that matched across all 47 witnesses. Children under 12 reported hearing nothing unusual, creating a clear age-based division in the community's experience. Amanda, the town's 38-year-old postal supervisor, served as the unofficial spokesperson for the community during the investigation. Her account, supported by every other adult resident, described a construction project that appeared to be building an exact replica of Coldfoot, approximately 50 feet beneath the existing town. The underground construction followed the same layout as the surface community, with sounds indicating the placement of buildings, roads, and infrastructure in patterns that perfectly match the town's above-ground configuration. On December 18th, residents reported that the Yalfer underground construction sounds began to include human voices, with workers apparently discussing their progress and coordinating activities. The voices were described as speaking in normal conversational tones, yet somehow audible through 50 feet of frozen ground and building foundations. More disturbing was the gradual realization that the voices belonged to the residents themselves, discussing construction work that none of them were actually performing. Christopher, a 52-year-old truck stop manager, documented the community's growing psychological strain as they heard underground versions of themselves planning and executing a construction project that duplicated their entire town. The underground voices discussed personal details about each resident's life, work schedules, and relationships that only the actual residents would know. Conversations included references to recent events, private conversations, and future plans that the surface residents had never shared with anyone. By December 19th, the underground construction sounds had expanded to include what residents described as normal town activity occurring below them. They reported hearing underground versions of themselves conducting daily business, operating the truck stop, processing mail, and maintaining social relationships that paralleled their surface activities. The underground community appeared to be functioning as a complete duplicate of Coldfoot, operating on the same schedules and following the same routines as the actual town. The psychological impact on the surface residents became severe as they realized they were hearing detailed conversations between underground versions of themselves and their neighbors. These conversations revealed intimate knowledge of personal relationships, financial concerns, health issues, and private thoughts that the residents had never discussed openly. The underground community appeared to have access to information that existed only in the minds of the surface residents. Jennifer, a 29-year-old medical clinic technician, reported that the underground conversations began to address the surface residents directly, with underground versions acknowledging the presence of their counterparts above ground. The underground residents expressed sympathy for what they described as the temporary nature of surface existence, suggesting that the surface community was somehow less permanent or real than the underground duplicate. The crisis escalated on December 20th, when all surface residents simultaneously reported that the underground construction sounds had stopped, replaced by the normal sounds of a functioning community that operated in perfect synchronization with their own activities. When surface residents moved through their town, they could hear their underground counterparts making identical movements at the same times. Conversations held on the surface were immediately repeated by underground voices, creating an echo effect that made normal communication extremely difficult. David, a 44-year-old maintenance supervisor, documented the community's discovery that the underground residents were not merely echoing surface activities, but were actually leading them. Surface residents began to notice that they were unconsciously following patterns that seemed to originate from below, with their daily routines being influenced by the activities of their underground counterparts. Simple decisions about work schedules, meal times, and social interactions appeared to be predetermined by the underground community. Lisa, a 31-year-old truck stop waitress, reported the most disturbing development when surface residents began to hear the underground community discussing the eventual transition that would occur once the underground town was fully operational. The underground voices described a process where the surface residents would gradually move below ground, leaving the surface town empty while continuing their lives in the completed underground duplicate. On December 21st, all surface residents reported experiencing periods where they felt compelled to move toward basement areas, storage spaces, and any underground access points in their buildings. During these episodes, residents described feeling pulled downward by a force they couldn't resist, accompanied by the sensation that their underground counterparts were physically reaching upward to guide them below. Several residents required physical restraint by neighbors to prevent them from attempting to dig through basement floors. The final day of the incident, December 22nd, brought what residents described as a negotiation between the surface and underground communities. Through conversations that all residents could hear, but none were consciously participating in, the two versions of Coldfoot appeared to be discussing terms for coexistence or transition. The underground community offered to allow surface residents to remain above ground during daylight hours while spending nights in the underground duplicate, effectively sharing time between two identical versions of their town. Michael, a 41-year-old truck driver, reported that the surface community collectively rejected this arrangement, insisting on maintaining their exclusive claim to the original town. The underground residents expressed disappointment, but agreed to abandon their duplicate community. With construction sounds resuming as the underground town was apparently dismantled, the dismantling process took exactly 24 hours, with residents hearing their underground counterparts saying goodbye and expressing hopes for future meetings. On December 23rd, all construction and community sounds from beneath Coldfoot ceased simultaneously, leaving the town in complete silence that residents described as more unsettling than the previous week of constant underground activity. The sudden absence of their underground counterparts created a sense of loss among surface residents who realized they had become emotionally attached to the duplicate community, despite the psychological terror it had caused. Investigation of the incident by multiple agencies failed to find any evidence of underground construction, excavation, or structural changes beneath Coldfoot. Ground-penetrating radar, seismic monitoring, and core samples all confirmed that the permafrost beneath the town remained undisturbed and showed no signs of any human activity. However, acoustic analysis of recordings made during the incident detected sound patterns that appeared to originate from underground sources, despite the physical impossibility of such sounds traveling through solid permafrost. The psychological evaluation of Coldfoot residents revealed no evidence of mass hysteria, shared delusions, or external influences that could account for their identical experiences. All residents maintained detailed, consistent memories of the underground construction and community activities, providing testimony that was remarkably coherent despite describing physically impossible events. Medical examinations found no evidence of toxins, chemicals, or substances that could cause hallucinations or altered mental states. The economic impact on Coldfoot has been significant, with several residents relocating to other communities due to ongoing anxiety about the potential return of their underground counterparts. The truck stop continues to operate, but staff turnover has increased dramatically as new employees report difficulty adjusting to the community's collective memory of the incident. Property values in Coldfoot have declined substantially, though official records attribute this to general economic conditions rather than the December 2025 incident. The Alaska Department of Public Safety has classified the Coldfoot incident as an unexplained phenomenon requiring ongoing monitoring. Seismic equipment has been permanently installed throughout the community to detect any future underground activity, though residents report that the monitoring equipment creates constant background noise that prevents them from hearing whether their underground counterparts might have returned. That concludes our journey through 7 documented encounters from Alaska's most remote regions, each one challenging everything we thought we knew about reality itself. These aren't just stories. They're windows into a world where the impossible becomes undeniably real, where ordinary people face extraordinary circumstances that forever change their understanding of what's possible in our world. Thank you for joining us here on Silent Fears, where we explore the documented cases that authorities would rather you never heard about. If these stories have left you questioning the nature of reality itself, then we've done our job. Subscribe for more true encounters that blur the line between the possible and the impossible. And remember, in Alaska's endless wilderness, the most terrifying stories are the ones that actually happened.